I found my son standing in the parking lot of his own restaurant, not inside greeting customers, not in the kitchen where he belonged, standing outside in the November cold, holding a cardboard box with both hands, like he was afraid it might fall apart. My granddaughter Emma was beside him, 7 years old, still wearing her school backpack, holding his sleeve with one small fist. When he saw my truck pull in, he didn't wave. He just looked at me, and his face did something I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old and came home to tell me his dog had died. "Dad," he said when I stepped out. They locked the doors. My brother-in-law called a locksmith this morning, said the lease was always in the family's name, said I was just an employee. I looked at Emma. She was watching me with those serious brown eyes she'd had since she was a baby, the kind of eyes that understood more than they were supposed to. "Get in the truck," I said. "Both of you." My son had no idea that I had been waiting 14 months for exactly this moment. He had no idea what I had built, quietly, while he was busy trusting the wrong people. And he had absolutely no idea that before this was over, the Whitfield family was going to lose everything they thought they'd taken from us. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're here for stories about family loyalty and hard-won justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below and tell me what would you have done in my position. And just so you know, while this story is based on real events, some names and details have been changed to protect people's privacy. But the lessons, every single one of them, is real. My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years in the restaurant industry, starting as a dishwasher at 17, and eventually building a small regional chain of 4 diners across western Tennessee that I sold for enough money to retire comfortably when I was 58. My son Marcus is 31. He inherited my instincts for hospitality and my stubbornness, which is both a blessing and a problem. 3 years ago, he fell in love with a woman named Claire Whitfield, married her within the year, and used his inheritance from me to open a farm-to-table restaurant called Gravel and Grace in downtown Nashville. I had concerns from the beginning, not about Claire. She was warm and funny and clearly loved my son. My concerns were about her family. Her father, Gerald Whitfield, was the kind of man who introduced himself by listing his accomplishments. He was a commercial real estate developer, owned dozens of properties across Middle Tennessee, and had that particular quality of successful men who had never once doubted themselves, the quality that makes them dangerous when they want something you have. The first time I met Gerald over dinner, he spent 45 minutes asking me about the diner chain I'd sold. Not polite questions, detailed questions, revenue per location, staffing ratios, what my contracts with suppliers had looked like. I answered vaguely and watched his eyes. There was something behind them I recognized. Not curiosity, calculation. On the drive home that night, I told my wife Margaret what I'd noticed. She told me I was being protective. She was probably right, but I started paying attention anyway. The first sign came 4 months after Gravel and Grace opened. Gerald offered to help Marcus secure a better lease on the building. The landlord Marcus had been renting from was an independent owner, a retired teacher named Mr. Benton, who liked Marcus and had given him favorable terms. Gerald said he knew people, said he could get Marcus better rates, said it was a wedding gift of sorts. Marcus was touched. He let Gerald handle the renegotiation. The new lease was in Claire's name. Marcus didn't think anything of it. They were married. What was hers was his, and what was his was hers, or so he believed. I asked to see the paperwork. Marcus waved me off, said his father-in-law had taken care of everything, said I worried too much. I asked again 2 weeks later. He showed me a summary, not the full document. The summary looked fine. I hired a real estate attorney to look into it anyway. Her name was Patricia Dunn, and she had 30 years of experience in commercial leases in Tennessee. She told me the situation was not catastrophic, but was worth watching. The lease gave Claire's family significant rights in the event of certain financial conditions. Conditions that could, under the right circumstances, be manufactured. That was 13 months before my son stood in a cold parking lot holding a cardboard box. I didn't tell Marcus what I'd found. Not yet. Because I had learned something in 35 years of business. If you react too early, before you understand the full shape of what's coming, you give people the chance to adjust. They shift their strategy. They cover their tracks. You spend your energy fighting shadows while they regroup and come at you from a different angle. I needed to understand everything before I moved. So I watched, and I waited, and I documented. I brought in a private investigator named Dale Hutchins, a former state police detective who had been doing corporate work for 15 years. I asked him to look at the Whitfield family's business history, their acquisition patterns, any legal disputes, any patterns in how they operated. What Dale found over the next 6 months painted a picture I had already suspected but hoped was wrong. The Whitfields had done this before, not with family, but with small business owners. There were 3 separate cases in the past decade where Gerald Whitfield had entered into a financial partnership with a small restaurant or retail business, helped them secure better lease arrangements, and then, when the business hit a difficult period, used the lease structure to push the original owner out. In 2 of the 3 cases, the business was rebranded and reopened under Whitfield family management within a year of the original owner's departure. In the 3rd case, it was sold to a third party at a significant profit. Gravel and Grace was not an accident. Marcus was not a son-in-law to Gerald. Marcus was an acquisition strategy. But there was more. Something Dale discovered that changed everything. Emma, my granddaughter, 7 years old. A child who called me Grandpa Bobby and insisted on sitting in the front seat of my truck even though she was too small for it, who had her father's stubbornness and her mother's laugh and a habit of narrating everything she was doing in a running commentary that could last 45 minutes while she colored. The reason Emma mattered in this particular way came through Dale's investigation almost by accident. He had been looking into the financial structure of the lease arrangement when he stumbled onto something in the Whitfield family's legal filings, a custody prearrangement, filed quietly 18 months earlier, before Marcus had any reason to think his marriage was in trouble. A document that had been prepared by a family law attorney connected to Gerald Whitfield's legal team, outlining a custody framework that assumed Claire would be the primary parent in the event of a marital separation. My son had never been told this document existed. I sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks, thought about what it meant, thought about the fact that while Marcus was working 80-hour weeks building something he believed in, the people he trusted had been preparing for his removal, not just from the business, from his daughter's life. I thought about Emma running to the door when Marcus came home from the restaurant at midnight, still demanding to show him the drawing she'd made that afternoon, about the way he sat with her every morning before school, the 2 of them eating cereal and watching nature documentaries on his phone, their private ritual that had started when she was 3 and never stopped. I made a decision. I would not tell him yet. Not until I had built something that couldn't be dismantled, not until every piece was in place. I would give my son the tools to win this. And then I would make sure Gerald Whitfield understood the difference between a target and an opponent. Marcus spent the first several days at my house, barely speaking. He sat at the kitchen table in the mornings with his coffee going cold, staring at the wall. He slept poorly. I could hear him moving around at 2 and 3 in the morning, the creak of the hallway floor outside the guest room. Emma adapted the way children always do, with that remarkable flexibility that adults lose somewhere around adolescence. She discovered my workshop in the garage and immediately appointed herself assistant project manager, handing me tools with great ceremony and offering opinions on everything I was building, whether I asked for them or not. On the 5th day, I called Marcus into my study and told him to close the door. He sat across from me, and I could see in his face that he understood something significant was about to happen. He had been waiting for it, the way you wait for a storm when the air pressure drops and the birds go quiet. I put a folder on the desk between us. "What is that?" he asked. "Open it." He did. I watched his face as he read through the first page, then the second. The confusion that moved into something harder, something focused. "This is a timeline," he said slowly. "This is a timeline of everything they did." "Yes. This goes back almost 2 years before we were even engaged." He looked up at me. "Dad, how long have you known about this?" "I began looking into it about 13 months ago," I said, "when I saw the lease arrangement." 13 months. He said it quietly, without accusation, turning the number over in his mind. You've known for 13 months that my wife's family was planning to take everything from me, and you didn't say anything. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know the full scope of it until much more recently, and I needed to know everything before I could help you effectively. If I had told you 13 months ago, you would have confronted Claire. She would have told her father. They would have accelerated their timeline, and we would have lost the advantage. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He had his mother's habit of going very still when he was processing something difficult, not shutting down, thinking. "There's more," he said finally. "Not a question." I pushed the second folder across the desk. This one was thicker. It contained the financial records showing how the lease had been structured, the legal paperwork outlining the custody prearrangement, Dale's findings about the Whitfield family's previous business acquisitions, and something else. Something I had discovered only 3 weeks earlier that had changed my understanding of the entire situation. Marcus stared at the custody document for a long time. His hands rested flat on the desk. His breathing was deliberate, controlled. The breathing of a man holding himself together by force of will. "They filed this before Emma was born," he said. 18 months before the restaurant ran into trouble. Before you had any indication the marriage was in difficulty. They were planning this before Emma could walk. He looked at me. "Claire knew about this?" "I believe so. I believe she has been in communication with her father and her brother about the business situation for at least 2 years. I have documentation of phone calls and meetings. What I cannot tell you with certainty is whether she agreed with the plan or was simply going along with what her family wanted." Marcus stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard where Emma was visible in the corner of the garden, crouching over something in the dirt, entirely absorbed. He watched her for a long moment. "What does the custody document actually say?" he asked. "It establishes a framework where Claire would have primary custody. You would have limited visitation. The grounds cited are unstable employment and financial instability, which they have now manufactured through the lease revocation. They fired me from my own restaurant and took my building so they could use it against me in a custody hearing." His voice was steady. The steadiness was more unsettling than anger would have been. "That's what this is. That is what this is." He turned from the window. "Tell me what we're doing about it." That was the moment I understood my son was going to be all right. The next 3 weeks were the most precisely coordinated thing I had ever managed, and I had spent 35 years managing complicated operations. Every morning at 7, Marcus and I met in the study to review the day's strategy. Every afternoon I worked the phones, coordinating the team I had quietly been assembling for months. Every evening we ate dinner together, the 3 of us, and talked about Emma's day, and kept the world outside the door. The team was 4 people. Patricia Dunn, the real estate attorney who had first looked at the lease for me and who had been building the legal case for 11 months. James Whitaker, a forensic accountant who had spent 20 years doing commercial litigation support and who had an extraordinary gift for finding the seams in financial structures. My younger brother Dennis, who had spent 30 years as a restaurant industry consultant and had contacts at every relevant licensing and regulatory body in Tennessee. And Dale Hutchins, who had continued documenting the Whitfield family's operations and now had a file that was, as he put it, unusually comprehensive. Patricia had identified 3 separate grounds on which the lease revocation could be challenged. The process had not followed the contractual requirements for notice and cure. The lease contained a spousal interest clause that had not been honored. And most significantly, there was evidence that the conditions triggering the revocation had been artificially induced. Gerald Whitfield had made 2 calls to Gravel and Grace's primary food distributor 3 months earlier. After those calls, the distributor had changed Marcus's payment terms, creating a cash flow problem that technically triggered the default clause in the lease. James had traced the financial relationship between Gerald Whitfield and that distributor. They had done business together for 11 years. The timing of the payment term change, coming within 3 weeks of Gerald's calls, was not coincidental. Dennis had been working a different angle. The Whitfields' plan, once they controlled the lease, was to reopen Gravel and Grace under a new name as part of their existing hospitality portfolio. They had already begun the licensing paperwork. Dennis had flagged concerns about the transfer of certain permits and certifications to the appropriate Tennessee regulatory bodies, not filing complaints, just raising questions that required answers, questions that would slow the process significantly. And Dale had something else. Evidence that Gerald Whitfield had made representations to two separate investors about Gravel and Grace's projected revenues under Whitfield management that did not align with the actual financial records of the business. Representations that, depending on how a prosecutor chose to look at them, could constitute securities fraud. We were not going to simply defend Marcus's rights to his restaurant. We were going to dismantle the mechanism Gerald Whitfield had spent 2 years constructing, and we were going to do it publicly enough that he could not simply regroup and use it on someone else. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in December. 2 days before it, Marcus came into the study at 11 at night and found me still at the desk. He sat in the chair across from me and didn't say anything for a minute. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. I waited. "I don't hate Claire." He said it like he was confessing to something embarrassing. "I know I probably should. I know what she was part of. But I think about her sitting at her father's table when she was Emma's age, learning to see people the way he sees them, as resources, as opportunities, and I feel, I don't know, something like pity almost." "That's not weakness," I said. "I know. I've been thinking about what I want Emma to understand about all this when she's old enough. I don't want her to grow up thinking her mother is a villain. I don't want her carrying that." He looked at me. "But I also need her to know that what was done to us was wrong. That you don't get to use people. That there are consequences. Both of those things can be true at the same time." "Yeah." He was quiet. "What I keep coming back to is Emma has never once doubted that I love her. Not 1 second of her life. And they thought they could use that against me. They thought they could threaten that, and I would just fold." His jaw set. "They don't understand what that love actually is." "No," I said. "They don't. Are we ready for Thursday?" I looked at my son, 31 years old, sitting in the same chair he'd sat in as a teenager when I'd called him in to have hard conversations about choices and consequences. A man who had been systematically deceived by people who should have protected him, and who had responded not with bitterness but with clarity, and I felt something in my chest that I didn't entirely have a word for. "We're ready," I said. "Get some sleep." The hearing was held in a family court in downtown Nashville. The Whitfield family arrived as a unit. Gerald was in a charcoal suit, and the expression of a man who had never lost in a courtroom. Claire's brother, Ryan, who had been the one to call the locksmith the morning this all began, sat beside Gerald with the particular smugness of someone who had done something unpleasant and believed he would face no consequences for it. Claire was between them, dressed carefully, her expression the kind of deliberately neutral that takes effort to maintain. Marcus and I sat at our table with Patricia. I was directly behind them in the gallery, positioned so that Gerald could see me clearly whenever he looked toward the front of the room. The first time he did, his expression didn't change. He had expected me. Good. Let him have known I was coming and still not known what I had prepared. The Whitfield attorney presented their position with professional smoothness. Marcus had abandoned his family business responsibilities, creating financial instability. The marital home was leased in Claire's name. Given the demonstrated pattern of financial mismanagement, primary custody should remain with the mother, who had stable family support and resources. It was a clean argument. It would have worked against anyone who hadn't spent 14 months preparing for it. Patricia stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the respondent's characterization of my client's situation as one of financial mismanagement is not only inaccurate, it is a description of conditions that were deliberately manufactured by the petitioner's own family. We intend to demonstrate that the financial difficulties cited as grounds for the custody arrangement were the result of a calculated interference campaign orchestrated by the petitioner's father, Gerald Whitfield, and that the lease revocation that preceded this hearing was part of a planned sequence of events that began before my client had any indication his marriage was at risk." She started with the distributor, laid out the timeline, Gerald's phone calls, the payment term change, the cash flow problem, the technical default, showed the 11-year business relationship between Gerald and the distributor, presented the communication records. The Whitfield attorney objected 3 times, was overruled twice. Patricia continued with the lease itself, presented the clause violations, the spousal interest provision, the inadequate notice. The structural issues that Patricia's analysis had identified over 11 months of careful preparation. She presented the custody pre-arrangement document, filed 18 months before the hearing, before Marcus had any reason to believe his marriage was in trouble. The judge looked at the date on that document for a long time without speaking. Then Patricia presented James's findings about the investor representations, laid them out carefully, precisely, in a way that didn't editorialize. Just the numbers, just the communications, just the gap between what had been said and what the records showed. Gerald's expression had changed. It was still controlled, but something had shifted behind the eyes. The calculation that had been there at that first dinner, the patient assessment of angles and leverage, it was working now, and I could see from across the room that it was coming up empty. Patricia concluded by presenting an 18-month record of Marcus's role as Emma's primary caregiver. Morning routines, school pickups, medical appointments attended, teachers and coaches who had provided written statements. The pediatrician who had never once seen Claire at a well-child visit without Marcus, and who had, on 3 occasions, seen Marcus bring Emma in alone. My client did not abandon his responsibilities, Patricia said. He was removed from his business by deliberate outside interference, and then presented to this court as evidence of his own failure. We are asking this court to see this situation for what it actually is. The judge called a recess. During the break, Gerald crossed the hall toward me. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, but I could see the adjustment happening in real time, the recalculation. He stopped about 3 feet from me. "Robert," he said. Friendly tone. The tone of a man offering to renegotiate. "Gerald, I think we've let this get more complicated than it needed to be. Marcus is a good young man. Claire loves him. Maybe there's a version of this where everyone comes out reasonably well." I looked at him for a moment. This man who had spent 2 years treating my son like a property acquisition, who had filed legal documents to restrict Marcus's access to his daughter before Marcus had done anything wrong, who had called a distributor to manufacture a financial crisis and then used that crisis as evidence of my son's failing. "Gerald," I said, "you're a very good businessman. You understand assets and liabilities. You understand how to structure a deal so the risk is yours only on paper." I took a step toward him, not aggressive, deliberate. "What you don't understand is the difference between people who have something to lose and people who have already lost everything they were afraid of losing. My son was afraid of losing his restaurant. You took it. He was afraid of losing his marriage. That's done. The only thing he has left to fight for is Emma. And you should understand that there is no calculation you can run, no angle you haven't considered, and no amount of money or leverage that changes what happens when a father is fighting for his child." I turned to go back inside. The licensing board receives a package Monday. The SEC inquiry has already been initiated. The Nashville Business Journal has a reporter who's been very interested in the Whitfield acquisition history. I paused. "Have a good rest of your afternoon." The judge returned and delivered her ruling, primary custody to Marcus, pending a 90-day review. The custody pre-arrangement was set aside as having been created in bad faith. The court ordered a full audit of the lease arrangement and referred the matter of the manufactured default to the appropriate civil authorities. Gerald's attorney was on his feet immediately, but the judge held up a hand that stopped the room. "I want to be very clear," she said, looking not at the attorneys but at the gallery, directly at Gerald Whitfield, that this court takes an extremely serious view of any attempt to manufacture the circumstances of a custody proceeding. What has been presented today will be examined carefully. Marcus didn't move for a long moment after the gavel came down. Then he turned and looked at me, and his face was something I won't try to find better words for than what it was. A man who had been told the truth was going to matter after all. Emma was at my house with my wife Margaret when we got home. She ran to Marcus at the door and wrapped both arms around his legs the way she had since she could walk, with the total commitment of a child who has decided you are her safe place. "Did it go okay?" she asked into his jacket. Marcus lifted her up. "It went okay, Bug. Are we staying at Grandpa Bobby's?" "For a while, yeah." She considered this with the gravity of someone making a major logistical assessment. "Okay, but I need my purple blanket and my markers." "We'll get them." She nodded, satisfied, and rested her head on his shoulder with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once doubted her father's ability to handle things. That night, After Emma was asleep, Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and didn't say much for a while. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets after something large has been resolved, a kind of held breath stillness. "What happens to them now?" Marcus asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. The licensing complications Dennis introduced will delay their plans for the restaurant by at least 8 months. The civil case around the manufactured default will likely result in a settlement. They'll want to keep it out of a courtroom. The SEC inquiry will take time, but James thinks there's enough there for a real investigation. Gerald's investors will start asking questions, if they haven't already. And Claire? I don't know. She participated in something that was wrong. Whether she understood the full scope of it, whether she chose it or was pressured into it, I don't know. That's between you and her, eventually. I don't want Emma to lose her mother. I know. Even after everything. He turned his coffee cup on the table. She's still Emma's mother, and Emma loves her. Then you protect that for Emma's sake. That's what a good father does. I looked at my son, and you're a good father. He was quiet for a moment. You know what I kept thinking about during the hearing? That morning with the cardboard box. Standing in that parking lot, I felt like everything I had built had just been taken away. The restaurant, the marriage, maybe even Emma. And then your truck came around the corner, and I thought, he knew. He already knew, and he came anyway. I always come. I know. He looked at me directly. I know that now in a way I didn't before. And I want Emma to know it too, the way I know it. Not just because someone told her, but because she's watched me do it. Show up, consistently, through the hard things. He paused. That's what you gave me. I want to give it to her. I didn't have anything to add to that. Some things land better without a response. What followed in the weeks and months after was more or less what I had projected. Gerald Whitfield stepped back from his public-facing business roles within 2 months, citing a desire to focus on family. His son Ryan left the company. The civil case settled for a figure that was disclosed only to the attorneys. The Nashville Business Journal piece ran on a Tuesday and was shared widely enough that several of Gerald's long-standing business relationships quietly ended. Gravel and Grace reopened 8 months later, in a different location, with Marcus as sole owner. He had better partners this time, people I had helped him find, people whose motivations I had spent several months verifying. The new restaurant was smaller, simpler, and by the end of its first year had a 3-month wait for reservations. Marcus and Claire went through a divorce that was difficult in the way divorces always are when there is a child involved, but less adversarial than it might have been. Claire's attorney, in the end, did not have much to work with. She has Emma on alternating weekends. By most accounts I have heard, she is trying. Emma turned 8. She lost 2 teeth in the same week, and treated it as an enormous achievement. She started a project of interviewing me on a toy recorder about my life, which she informed me she planned to turn into a book, and which has produced about 14 hours of recordings, mostly consisting of her laughing at her own questions. About a year after the custody hearing, I sat in my study, writing in the journal I had started when I first hired Dale, and began documenting what I suspected. The journal was almost full. It had started as a record of a threat. It had become something else. I wrote, I built a business from nothing, sold it for more than I expected, put money away and thought I understood what security meant. I thought security was what you accumulated, property, resources, freedom from dependence. I was right about some of it and wrong about the most important part. Security is not what you accumulate. Security is what you build in the people you love. Every morning my son sat with his daughter eating cereal and watching animals on his phone. He was building something that no lease arrangement can touch. Every time he showed up, every time he chose her over sleep or convenience or pride, he was constructing the thing that matters, the thing Gerald Whitfield's entire operation could not account for, because Gerald Whitfield does not know what it is. I closed the journal. Through the window I could see the yard, evening light going long and gold across the grass. Marcus was there with Emma. The two of them crouched over something at the edge of the garden, a plant she was apparently very invested in, based on the length of the discussion. He was listening to her with the full, patient attention he has always given her, the attention of a man who understands that what his daughter is saying matters even when it is about a plant. Gerald Whitfield stood in a courthouse 6 months later, facing 3 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit civil fraud. His attorney was good, the case was better. He received a suspended sentence and a fine that, for a man of his resources, probably stung more as a matter of public record than as a financial consequence. What cost him more was the reputation. In a business built on relationships and trust, the kind of story that had been told about him in depositions and court documents and a newspaper series was not survivable. He is retired now, in the technical sense of the word. I don't think much about whether he has learned anything. Some people do and some people don't, and the outcome of my son's life doesn't depend on which kind Gerald Whitfield is. What I think about instead is Marcus at 31, standing in a parking lot holding a cardboard box, face crumbling, and Marcus at 32, standing in his new restaurant on opening night with Emma beside him wearing a tiny version of a chef's apron that Margaret had made for her, both of them looking at the room they had built together. Same man, different footing. I spent a long time in my life believing that the point of what I was building was the building itself. The business, the money, the chain of diners. It took my son nearly losing everything to help me understand that those things were never the point. They were the means. The point was always the people. The point was always this: a father and a daughter in a garden at evening, talking about a plant like it's the most important conversation in the world, which, for that moment, it is. If you're watching this and you have people in your life who depend on you, don't wait for the parking lot moment. Don't wait until someone tries to take something before you understand what it's worth. Show up now. Document what matters now. And if someone does come for your family, be patient, be thorough, and make absolutely sure that when you move, you don't miss. That's what I learned. I hope it costs you less to learn it than it cost us.